политолога, философа, историка, я даже не знаю, кем в большей степени является Джон. Джон автор многих книг, переведенных на французский, испанский, русский, чешский, сербский языки. Книги Джона посвящены истории политических процессов, политической истории Франции, идеологическим процессам. И тема его сегодняшней лекции звучит чрезвычайно интересно, я бы даже сказал необычно. От Ленина до Леннона левая идеология на Западе во время и после холодной войны. Прошу.
Спасибо, Володя. Я благодарю фонд исторической перспективы за приглашение. Я вас благодарю за ваше присутствие. К сожалению, я не буду прочитать свою лекцию на русском языке, но на английском, по-моему, у вас есть уже русский перевод. Пожалуйста, читайте перевод, но я буду медленно читать свой английский текст. As Vladimir Romanov has said, the title of my talk today is From Lenin to Lennon. And as you can see, I begin my paper with two quotations, one from Lenin and one from John Lennon. The one in 1917, the other in 1971. Both quotes I expect you know fairly well. Lenin's quotation, so long as the state exists, there is no freedom, and when there will be freedom, there will be no state. And John Lennon's song Imagine, which says more or less the same thing. I also have, at the beginning of my text, another quotation, but this time from a well-known political figure in Europe, Václav Klaus, whom I know personally and who is a remarkable European politician. He's mainly known for his economic liberalism, but I've begun my text with this quotation, which you can find on the first page of the Russian translation. He said on the 28th of October 2010, Klaus said, on the Czech National Day, he said, I beg your pardon, the 28th of September 2010, he said, if we continue to perceive our common national existence authentically as something different from the national existence of other nations, then something follows from this. Then we have a vital need for our anchor, our state. Then it is appropriate that we turn to the legacy, the traditions, and the hard-won experiences of our ancestors. End of quotation. As I'm sure you will agree, it's quite rare to hear an economic liberal defend the state. Liberals are usually placed on the right, in the political spectrum, because they oppose the supposed statism of the left. They're usually considered to be anti-statists. So we do not expect to hear a liberal defend the state. And of course, the experience of communism during the Cold War reinforced this left-right paradigm, with left-wingers supporting the state and right-wingers opposing it. But of course, this is a distortion of political tradition. Traditionally, it is the left that invented the idea that the state should be destroyed. It is the left that is traditionally anti-statist. The French Revolution, which of course is the beginning really of left-wing ideology, was predicated on the idea, on the universalist idea, that men should be governed by human rights alone and not by individual hierarchical political structures. And any political arrangement that was merely inherited from the past and had not been invented by men was considered to be a bad thing and should be rejected because it had not been based, or it is not based, on a deliberate act of human will and human volition. So this anti-state ideology, which was born in the French Revolution, reached its fullest expression in the writings of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Engels was particularly clear about this. He foresaw that the state would wither away and that the government of men would be replaced by the administration of things. He wrote that in the Anti-Düring. And with Marx in the Communist Manifesto, Engels and Marx together welcomed the revolutionary force of capitalism. It's very important to remember this paradox. They welcomed the revolutionary force of capitalism, of international capitalism, saying that this bourgeois revolution, as they called it, would tear down national structures, especially the nation state and the family, and that this bourgeois revolution, this international capitalist revolution, would lead to the creation of a world proletariat, which would eventually, of course, unite against the bourgeoisie. Nations and states, according to Marx and Engels, would disappear and give way to a cosmopolitan new world order. Marx and Engels wrote, "The worker has no country." So in addition to this traditional left-wing support for universalist forms of political arrangement, in other words, this left-wing hostility to the state, in contrast to this left-wing position, the right, traditionally, stands for that which is particular, that which is individual, and therefore for the state. The left is universalist, the right is particularist. The state is by definition a specific historical arrangement. It's specifically rooted in history, in geography, and in other factors. It's not a universalist arrangement based on universal ideas. Edmund Burke, the great British, or Irish if you like, philosopher who denounced the French Revolution and its abstract principles, was famously in favor of the little platoon, as he called it, the little platoon, the small social group. Small social groups, but then of course the state itself as a larger version of these small social groups. He was in favor of really existing societies, of societies which really did exist and which really had a historical memory and a continuity. And he reacted against the universalism of the left, and this distinction between universalism on the one hand and particularism or realism, if you like, on the other, has had a decisive influence, I think, on the flow of European politics ever since the French Revolution. So when in 1989 the communist system collapsed first in Eastern Europe and then in the Soviet Union, it was a great paradox that this system was swept away not by right-wing politics of nationalism or of the state, not in the West at any rate, but instead by the very opposite. The communist system, the Soviet system, the communist system in Eastern Europe was swept away by an anti-state and internationalist ideology associated with economic liberalism. And this universalist ideology came from the supposedly anti-leftist West, from the supposedly, as it were, right-wing West. The communist bloc was obviously left-wing. The West that opposed it was by definition or by extension right-wing, and yet it was the West which managed to defeat the East by having a more powerful anti-state and universalist ideology than communism had at that stage. The paradox was perhaps only apparent to the extent that the communist regimes in the East were, of course, notorious for their statism. They had long since departed from the original anti-statist ideology. In practice, of course, they were heavily statist. As we know, this was true of Stalinism and of post-Stalinism, but ultimately it was true of Leninism itself. Leninism is, after all, a byword for political centralization. So we can say that to some extent these regimes had become, as it were, right-wing regimes. In particular, because of course they strongly cultivated, as we know, a sense of patriotism. In contrast to this, the political and intellectual and cultural atmosphere of the West in the decades which preceded 1989, and of course, particularly in the 1980s, in other words, in the decade in which the Cold War finally came to an end and which the communist system was finally defeated. In the West, the 1980s, so that decade, was a period, as I'm sure you know, of very pronounced economic and financial liberalization. This had many aspects, but what it meant was that the East and the West were engaged in a sort of political transvestitism, where each of them took the other's clothes. And the West in particular, of course, as I say, managed to produce an ideology which was much closer to the original anti-statist ideology of Marx and Lenin than was the system that was in fact practiced in the Soviet bloc. In the West in the 1980s, the ideology of privatization gave the appearance that the private sector and freedom generally were growing at the expense of the state. When in 1986 in London, there was a wave of deregulation known as the Big Bang under the aegis of Mrs. Thatcher. This was all presented as a way of overcoming the state. Mrs. Thatcher's ideology and political language often referred to reducing the role of the state, and in one famous quotation, to rolling back the frontiers of the state. I, of course, probably don't need to add that she herself was by no means anti-statist. She was, on the contrary, a patriot, a nationalist, and so on. But nonetheless, she used this vocabulary. And the same vocabulary was used against her, as it happens, by European federalists who pushed forward their plans for European federalism and European unification on the basis of a model of economic liberalization. The Single European Act was signed in 1986, in the same year as the Big Bang, and later the Treaty of Maastricht in 1991, signed in 1992, used the concept of currency union to drive ahead political union. But in both cases, with the single market and with the creation of the euro, the propaganda was the same as that which Mrs. Thatcher had used, namely that barriers between states needed to be destroyed, needed to be abolished in order for there to be greater freedom, and ultimately in order for the state to disappear. Now, as I've already suggested, the anti-state character of political liberalism, of political liberalization in the 1980s was not necessarily clear at first sight. Not only Mrs. Thatcher, but also Ronald Reagan never wanted to dismantle the state. They were, on the contrary, patriots. They loved their country, and they felt that the state, their respective states, had been hijacked by sectoral interests, in the case of Britain, by the trade unions. And they also understood that free trade was as important inside a state as much as between states. Since most economic activity is local, the great bulk of economic activity is actually local in all economies, they argued that a regime of low taxes and light regulation was desirable at home as much as abroad. But this project was effectively hijacked by people with a completely different agenda. It was, if you like, colonized by the left. And the ideology of the free market at this stage in the 1980s was deployed in a specifically Marxist way and in a specifically Marxist sense. This, by the way, goes a long way to explaining certain movements within the communist establishments of Eastern Europe. As I'm sure you know, a lot of the dissidents, the people who proclaimed themselves dissidents within the Soviet Union and within the Warsaw Pact countries, were in fact from the political left. And like the Marxist dissident Milovan Djilas, whom I've quoted here in this text, they believed, and I quote Djilas, this is Djilas's book from 1998, Djilas wrote, "The Soviet Union was objectively the most reactionary great power because the Soviet Union was destroying the world market instead of stimulating it further." So Djilas explains in this quotation the mentality I am talking about. He explains that the Soviet Union was considered from a Marxist perspective to be a reactionary power because it was preventing the creation of the world market. These people, these left-wing anti-communists, remembered that Marx himself had addressed the Free Trade Congress in 1847, and that he had himself written, and I quote, "The free trade system hastens the social revolution." So these people attacked the USSR for promoting what they called state capitalism, but what they hated about that phrase was the state part of the word, and not, of course, so much the capitalism. So in the minds of many Western politicians throughout the 1980s and 1990s, just as in the minds of Marx and Engels, the ideology of globalization, which, as you know, exploded in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet system, the ideology of globalization was specifically understood as an instrument for dismantling the nation state. In France, the very pro-market former finance minister Alain Madelin declared, "Liberalism is a philosophy of the sovereignty of the person and not the state. The sovereign state," Madelin said, "is the enemy." End of quotation. And that's why Madelin was on the right, by the way. He was a right-wing figure, a right-wing political figure. But that's why sentiments like this help us to understand how the ideology of the free market became harnessed to advance this post-national and even anti-national project. The president of the European Commission in the 1980s, the man who created the single market, Jacques Delors, also French but socialist, used the free market and the idea of the free market to pass both the Single European Act in 1986, which created the single, which brought the single market into being in 1992. So the act was passed in 1986, but the implementation took 6 years and was realized finally in 1992. He pushed forward not only the realization of the single market in 1992, but also the idea of the creation of the single currency, what we now know as the euro. The document which announced the plan for the creation of the single currency and which was eventually implemented in 1999 was called the Delors Report, published in April 1989. So both these ostensibly liberal measures, the realization of the single market and the creation of the euro, were in fact a means for erasing nationhood in Europe and creating instead a post-national and post-modern quasi-federation. And of course, since the end of the Cold War, the modern doctrine of globalization has put all the emphasis on the internationalist aspects of free trade and almost none on the domestic aspects of free trade. If you listen to people talk about free trade now, what they mean is free trade between states. They never discuss, ever, the reduction of regulation within economies, within nation states, because free trade has simply become an internationalist ideology. And I hardly need add that this has also been the period in which supranational organizations like the European Union and the World Trade Organization, which was created in the 1990s, have been set up in order to manage this new international free trade system on a supranational basis. These organizations are building blocks towards world government. Now, I mentioned Alain Madelin just now and quoted him saying that the sovereign state is the enemy. He may not have known this, but he was echoing something which the eminently left-wing Daniel Cohn-Bendit said in 1968. Daniel Cohn-Bendit is now a member of the European Parliament for the Green Party in Germany. He is German by nationality, but it was he who led the student revolt in France, in Paris, in May 1968. And he said, I quote, "What we want is to put man and no longer the state at the center of society." In other words, Alain Madelin's view, and I repeat, he is a right-wing and in fact was in his youth an extreme right-wing politician, was nothing other than the ideology of 1968. It was quite literally the same thing. And we must never forget how enormous was the influence of 1968, of the 1960s generally, on the political and intellectual and cultural atmosphere in Western Europe. It was absolutely fundamental. It's an absolutely fundamental point. And of course, these decades I'm talking about, the 1980s and the 1990s, were of course the decades in which the people, and into the 2000s, these were the decades in which the people who were young in 1968 came to power. One of the slogan then was, "The French tricolor is made to be torn up." And many of the people, as I say, who pushed forward this left-wing ideology using ostensibly right-wing instruments, they all, in their different ways, came from the various anti-Soviet left-wing movements that existed all over the place in Western Europe, in universities, in political parties, and so on. Anti-Soviet, yes, but not anti-communist. Cohn-Bendit is an example of these people, of this type of person who became powerful at this time in the West. Another good example is Bernard Kouchner, who is a former communist who founded a very ideological medical organization called Les Médecins du Monde, which I'm sure you've all heard of. I say ideological because Médecins du Monde promotes the idea that there is a right of interventionism and so on, including by foreign armies. And Kouchner, of course, he became almost a symbol, really, of this post-national ideology when he was appointed High Representative in Kosovo by the United Nations administration in that province. I say it's a symbol because the administration of Kosovo is a perfect example of this kind of post-political and post-national governance. It had no legitimacy, needless to say, certainly no democratic legitimacy in Kosovo itself. Kouchner then became the foreign minister of France, but he became foreign minister of France in the government of a supposedly right-wing president, Nicolas Sarkozy. So again, we can see the convergence, if you like, between left-wing liberals and right-wing liberals. Another good example is José Manuel Barroso, who for 10 years, I believe, was president of the European Commission. President of the European Commission is by far the most powerful office in the European Union. But in the 1970s, Barroso was a Maoist. He was the president of the student branch of it's a very complicated title, the Reorganized Movement of the Party of the Proletariat, which was the Maoist party which drove the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974. Václav Havel, who of course became an emblem of anti-Soviet left-wing ideology, was in the 1960s a famous or notorious promoter of free love, world peace, the end of the nation state, and all the rest of it. He was, of course, one of the main European figures to argue in favor of the attack on Yugoslavia in the name of post-nationalism in 1999. And then there's a whole list of other intellectuals like Bernard-Henri Lévy, Jürgen Habermas, André Glucksmann. All of these people, again, like the politicians I mentioned, they all come from this anti-Soviet left, so Maoist, Trotskyites, and so on. And when they came to power and influence in the 1980s and 1990s, they all became advocates of humanitarian interventionism, of European integration, and of globalization. And what this shows, and it's a point that I cannot emphasize strongly enough, it's one of the big reasons why Russia and the West continue to misunderstand each other. What this shows us, and I repeat, it's an absolutely crucial point, is that Marxist ideology was extremely widespread in the West throughout the whole of the Cold War. We must never forget this, particularly in universities. Indeed, from the certainly from the 1970s, and that the process began in the 1960s, but certainly by the 1970s, in my own country, and I'm sure in Germany and France, there were literally no conservative universities at all. Every single university, including Oxford, where I went, was completely left-wing by the time I went there in the 1980s. So you had a variety of elements. You had, of course, in some countries, orthodox communist parties, which were powerful, which were pro-Soviet, pro-Moscow, proper communist parties. And again, we must never forget that they were quite powerful. And they very nearly took power in Italy, for example, in 1948. But they were never close to power in other countries. But they nonetheless, in France, for example, the French Communist Party was extremely powerful. The Italian Communist Party was extremely powerful. But in addition to these pro-Soviet communist parties, traditional communist parties, there were also plenty of anti-Soviet communists or anti-Soviet leftists in the Trotskyite and Maoist traditions. And it's, as I've said, it's these people who were to play such a key role in the decades before and after the Cold War. We must never forget, in fact, that although, of course, ultimately they were from the same family, the hatred of the Soviet Union among these Trotskyites and Maoists was already very intense in the 1960s. Daniel Cohn-Bendit in 1968 famously fell out with and disagreed with the communist trade unions, the CGT. He famously denounced them, attacked them as les crapules staliniens, Stalinist scum. Because, of course, unlike them, he was never interested in the slightest in the fate of workers or in the living wage of a working man. He had much more sophisticated ideas about, you know, the end of the nation state. So such people were anti-Soviet because the anti-state and world revolutionary form of communism had been physically expelled from the Soviet Union when Trotsky was exiled in 1929. And I've often said that we can see in this expulsion of Trotsky from the Soviet Union in 1929, we can see, as it were, a response, Stalin's response to the decision by the German Imperial High Command to send Lenin to the Finland station in 1917. I'm sure you know that Winston Churchill described this decision to send Lenin into Russia as similar to putting poison into the water supply of a city. So Churchill understood that the Leninist ideology, he understood that the Germans, of course, wanted Lenin instead of Kerensky because Lenin they knew would sign a separate peace. But Churchill saw that this would also poison Russia ideologically. Well, Stalin returned the compliment, and he sent Trotsky into the West, who in turn ideologically poisoned the West. And you know, you can't underestimate the influence of Trotsky and the influence of Trotskyism in the West. Trotsky was the first celebrity politician. He was the first celebrity communist. He was as much a celebrity as Che Guevara was to become later. Che Guevara is still a celebrity. You often see people with posters of Che Guevara in their bedrooms all over Europe, or T-shirts with Che Guevara. But Trotsky had that image before. And you know, there is a direct continuity between this implantation of Trotskyism and some of the ideologies that came to power, as I say, later on. One of the most interesting continuities is with the American neoconservatives. The founder of the American neoconservative movement, Irving Kristol, wrote in 1983 that he was proud of having joined the Fourth International in 1940, which was just 2 years after Trotsky founded it. And this, as I say, this dominant left-wing atmosphere explains why anti-communist dissidents were really not very popular in Western intellectual circles at all during the Cold War. I was at Oxford when Andrei Sakharov went there in 1988. And I remember we went into a downstairs lecture room. There were maybe 100 people, perhaps 100 people there. They were all Sovietologists. So they went because they were interested in the Soviet Union anyway. But if someone like Nelson Mandela had visited Oxford in 1988, I can absolutely guarantee you that a football stadium would not have been big enough to accommodate all the people who would have wanted to see him. Because, of course, Sakharov, being against the Soviet Union, or as it were, against communism, did not have the celebrity status that somebody like Mandela had, who was against this evil right-wing regime in South Africa. So pride of place was given in the West to, as I've said, to critical Marxists, to dissidents who were, yes, against the Soviet system, but dissidents who were against the practice of communism, but not exactly against the theory, who on the contrary continued to uphold the theory. Many of these leading dissidents, especially the ones popular in the West, continue to be feted and celebrated today. The European Parliament awards its Sakharov Prize to icons of political correctness like Nelson Mandela, Alexander Dubček, Ibrahim Rugova, the leader of Kosovo, former leader of Kosovo, Reporters Without Borders, and so on. And you know, again, although I've said that Sakharov was unpopular, which is true, he was nonetheless himself also emblematic of this future ideology of convergence. He, in fact, argued that there would be a convergence between capitalism and communism, and that the two systems would somehow grow together. So what I'm trying to say in reminding you of all these various things is that we have to understand the end of the Cold War and the defeat, as it was a defeat, the defeat of the Soviet system. We have to understand it not, the defeat of communism, not as the victory of an ideological opponent, but instead as the victory of an ideological rival. The West's liberalism was an ideological rival to communism. It was an opponent to the extent that it was a rival. But it tried and succeeded in beating communism on its own terms, on communism's own terms, by showing itself to be more progressive, more internationalist, and more anti-statist than communism, than the communist system was in practice. It also, of course, showed itself to be more successful materially. But again, that was fighting the battle on communism's own terms. I'm sure you all know the famous scene, which is on YouTube, which shows Nikita Khrushchev in America in 1959 when he goes to see Nixon. The so-called kitchen debate, you can see it on YouTube. And he boasts to Nixon, he says, we are going to overtake you, and then we will wave goodbye as we overtake you. The West, as I say, beat communism on its own terms. The West, Stalin and his successors certainly abandoned the worst aspects of Stalinism. There was no or little political terror in the Soviet Union. After Stalin's death, there was a little bit in the early Khrushchev years, but really, broadly speaking, from the 1960s, mid-1960s onwards, there was no political terror. But what people in the West, or what the political elites in the West continued to denigrate the Soviet Union for, was its social conservatism. The West promoted left-wing opponents of the Soviet system, partly because it knew that the right-wing opponents were always going to be opponents of communism, but also because, as I say, it wanted to beat communism on its own terms. It wanted to show that the Western system was more progressive than the Soviet system, which, by contrast, was reactionary. And there's an excellent book, which I've quoted in the footnote here, called The Cultural Cold War by Francis Stoner Saunders, which explains how the CIA supported in the cultural sphere musicians, painters, and other artists who were put forward as being more radical and more progressive than the equivalent artists in the Soviet Union. So, for example, they put forward Stockhausen to show Shostakovich as a reactionary composer. They put forward Jackson Pollock to show socialist realism as a reactionary form of painting, and so on. And that is why, when in 1989 the whole system came crashing down, it was possible for the West to push forward this internationalism and this progressive ideology which it had been nourishing for so many decades. In 1989, in fact, there was a poster in Prague which showed that, if you think about it, 89 is simply 68 turned upside down. In other words, they wanted to show, and Havel himself made this very clear in many statements, that 1989 was just the continuation of 1968. And that's why at that stage, fashionable leftism was absolutely triumphant. And what is more, at this stage, many ideas which, as part of the Cold War, had been dismissed as Soviet propaganda, ideas like revolution, peace through internationalism, and so on, these ideas suddenly became very popular in the West and were accepted at their face value. Mikhail Gorbachev, as you all know, was intensely popular in the West because his bestseller, Perestroika, which everybody bought but nobody read, was called New Thinking for Our Country and for the Whole World. Like Sakharov, he was a proponent of this theory of convergence between communism and capitalism. But both of them said nothing other than what Francis Fukuyama was to say in his famous essay of 1989 about the end of history. This essay struck a deep chord. It was intensely famous. It's still famous now. It was a short essay at first, then it became a book later, but it was an essay because it struck such a deep chord in the West, which had been ideologically prepared, as I say, by this decade-long work of Marxism, particularly in universities. That's why it was so successful and so well received. And so all these cultural and intellectual and political currents made it possible in the 1990s for the international system to be given a radical overhaul. And the 1990s were therefore a period in which supranational institutions were systematically strengthened. I suppose it all started on the 11th of September 1990, when President George Bush the father proclaimed a new world order. This was just after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And he meant by that that the United Nations Security Council would henceforth authorize the use of force for the enforcement of international law. On the 21st of November 1990, the supranational Charter for a New Europe was signed in Paris. Symbolically, it was the very day, this was the charter that brought the OSCE into existence. This was the very day that Mrs. Thatcher, who had fought against the end of the nation state, was overthrown by people of her own party back in London. Supranational military interventionism was practiced by the United Nations in Iraq in 1991 and again in Yugoslavia in 1992. We all remember, or I remember very well, the attack on Yugoslavia in 1999. But one of the first UN interventions, not the first, but one of the first after the Cold War, was when the Blue Helmets were sent into Yugoslavia in 1992. International criminal tribunals were created in 1993 for Yugoslavia, in 1994 for Rwanda. In 1995, the GATT round, which was a series of international meetings, was transformed into a permanent supranational structure, the World Trade Organization. In 1999, NATO, which adopted a new security strategy, a new strategic concept, as it called it. It had already adopted a new document in 1991, when the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. It adopted a new one in 1999, at the very time when it was bombing Yugoslavia. And these trends of creating new international, supranational institutions, these continued into the 2000s with the creation of the International Criminal Court in 2002, and even, I would say, with the second Iraq War, the Anglo-American Iraq War of 2003, which, although illegal, like the Yugoslav War, was nonetheless based, according to the official propaganda, on United Nations Security Council resolutions. It wasn't in reality, but they claimed that it was. So all these institutional changes were inspired by the very supranational philosophy that I've been discussing, and above all by the idea that the nation state is bad and that it is a force of instability, and that without supranational organizations, nation states will go to war and there will be chaos. So while what happened at the moment of the collapse of the Soviet system and the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, was that the West rearmed itself ideologically and militarily. It literally rearmed itself. It gave itself a new ideological mission at the very time when the social structures and the state structures in the East were completely dismantled, and when, as we know, particularly in the case of Russia, there was just basically 10 years of chaos. Supranational institutions, especially the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and its principal body, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, based in Warsaw, were created to oversee human rights and elections. The assumption always being that human rights, that in human rights, as in elections, the state would be the violator. They always assumed that the state would violate human rights and that the state would cheat in elections. The state was never understood as a mechanism for protecting human rights and for ensuring that elections were correctly conducted. That was never even entertained as a possibility by the people who worked in these institutions. And at the same time, and again, I'm sure you know this, non-governmental organizations were raised to the level of political sainthood, as if in virtue of being non-governmental, they were necessarily virtuous. They were rather like the political commissars in the early Soviet system. They quickly became the new, the guardians of the new ideology. They were the police guard dogs, if you like, of the new internationalist ideology. And as I say, this was because being non-governmental, they were assumed to be more virtuous than governmental actors. So in the name of the very Hegelian and therefore proto-Marxist concept of civil society, these people, these NGOs, wielded immense political power by profiling themselves as virtuous because they were allegedly not political. So states in this period, in the post-communist period, in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, were dislocated from above, and of course in Western Europe as well. So across the whole European continent, they were dislocated from above by the creation of supranational structures, and they were dislocated from below by this promotion of anti-state ideology, by the proliferation of NGOs, and so on. All this had in common that the notion, the legitimacy of statehood itself was undermined. And this is why we observe now across the world. I mentioned earlier that certain concepts like revolution and peace through internationalism, which were eminently communist concepts, these have now migrated and were now adopted by the West and now constitute items of political dogma that nobody questions anymore. There was another communist practice which has taken off and has exploded in the post-communist period, and that is the use of the judicial system for political purposes. Everybody remembers the famous Moscow show trials, everybody denounces them, and yet at the same time we have a proliferation of international criminal tribunals, an explosion in the practice of putting former heads of state on trial. There's a new head of state put on trial almost every 6 months now, whereas it almost never happened in the past. And there is a complete blindness now around the world to the possibility that the judicial process in such trials can be abused, as of course it is. Again, with these new tribunals, we can see the specifically supranational ideology, or rather anti-national ideology at work. One of the most important facts about these new tribunals is that they target heads of state. They don't target actual perpetrators of war crimes. They much prefer to target heads of state. The International Criminal Court has indicted 2 heads of state. It indicted the president of Sudan in 2009 and the leader of Libya in 2011. In both cases, neither of the 2 states in question had ratified the Rome Treaty creating the International Criminal Court. So by any normal legal standard, the court did not have jurisdiction over either Sudan or Libya, and yet they issued indictments against their presidents. This is all because the International Criminal Court, like the other international tribunals, are part of this very determined ideology of creating world government. And there's no doubt that this is the case. This is not some crazy conspiracy theory. The International Criminal Court was created after a conference was convened in New York in 1995 by a supposedly non-governmental organization, in reality, of course, financed by governments, as they all are, but an officially non-governmental organization called the Coalition for an International Criminal Court, whose principal leader is a man called William Pace. William Pace is not only the convener of this coalition for an international criminal court, he is also the executive director of the World Federalist Movement. The World Federalist Movement, which was created in 1947, adopted then something called the Montreux Declaration, which calls for world federal government, the limitation of national sovereignty, the creation of supranational armed forces, the suppression of all attempts against the security of the World Federation, and the control by the world federal government of atomic development and other scientific discoveries capable of mass destruction. In other words, these crazy people literally want a world government armed with nuclear weapons and the right to prevent any attacks against the security of the world government. So this is not, I'm not inventing this. This man, William Pace, who believes this stuff, was the main person behind the creation of the International Criminal Court. And you can see, I repeat, I'm sorry to insist on this, but it is important. In the statute of the International Criminal Court, you can see the anti-state ideology in black and white on paper, through the fact that judicial immunity is awarded by the statute of by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Judicial immunity from all prosecution is awarded to the judges and the prosecutors, interestingly not to the defense, the judges and the prosecutors of the International Criminal Court. The same immunity is denied, as you well know, to heads of state, who, of course, in most constitutions do indeed enjoy legal immunity. You can see there, black on white, how the Rome Statute of the International Court, the International Criminal Court, awards itself powers and protection which it denies to heads of state. It's a clearly supranational organization. And I repeat, very few people question these tribunals. Very few people ask about the trials. People don't follow the trials. They don't ask whether the procedures are fair. They instead assume that the accusations are true, and they assume that the heads of state who are accused, for example, the head of state of Ivory Coast, Laurent Gbagbo, who is also incidentally whose trial has just started. I'm sorry, I said earlier that there were two heads of state. There are three. The difference with Gbagbo is that the Ivory Coast had ratified the Rome Statute. But anyway, there have been three heads of state. The assumption is that these heads of state are indeed evil and that the states that they have been presidents of have committed war crimes. The assumption is never that the trial might be unjust or that the accusation might be unjust. And again, we can see here a very clear imitation of early Bolshevik practice, because in the very early years of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Bolsheviks conducted agitation trials, which were actually not trials. They were, in fact, pieces of theater. They were not trials, but they were called trials. So political commissars would arrive in a town, they would take a theater or a town hall, and they would enact a play, basically a play. And these trials, so-called trials, were supposed to teach the proletariat about the merits of communism. Well, we can see exactly the same didactic ideology in the International Criminal Court, which says, I've quoted here, it says that one of the roles of the International Criminal Court is to establish, quote, an indisputable historical record. Well, how can there be an indisputable historical record? There's no such thing as an indisputable historical record. Everybody's always going to argue about history. And to teach other political lessons, in particular, that the powerful will be held to account. So that's the actual statute of the trial. But on some occasions, the International Criminal Court stages literally agitation trials, because it literally stages pieces of theatre which are supposed to teach people about trials. In 2009, they did one in the Congo, where they staged a play called The ICC, Our Hope. And quite honestly, the press release that the ICC produced after this piece of theatre could have been taken from the pages of Pravda reporting on these agitation trials in the early 1920s. So, as I'm sure you've understood, my message to you today is that we have to understand the Cold War not as the victory of conservative values over liberal or progressive values over communism, but on the contrary, as a victory of more progressive values over less progressive ones, which led to a sort of migration of the original Marxist ideas from the East, where they had been implanted for 70 years, to the West, and indeed to the whole now of Europe. And this notion of migration, I mean, I don't want to become mystical, but Marx and Engels did, after all, start, as you know, the Communist Manifesto with the phrase, "A spectre is haunting Europe." It is as if a kind of ghost, as in the Bible, you know, the ghost, once it's been in the gospel, once it's been in one person, leaves that person and then moves into other people. There is, let's not forget, there is a very close temporal coincidence between the main events in the Soviet bloc and the main events, the main post-national or anti-national developments which happened in the European Union in the 1980s. For example, in March 1985, Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He immediately announced the bankruptcy of the Soviet system by proclaiming perestroika about a month later. And by December of that year, so only a few months after the Soviet leadership had admitted that the system was broken, the decision had been taken by the European community to create the single market, and this was then duly signed the following year in June 1986. Similarly, the first plan for the integration, for the monetary and geopolitical integration of Europe around a German core or Franco-German core was taken by was proposed by two advisors in the German Chancellor's office in Bonn 2 weeks after Gorbachev told Helmut Kohl that the Soviet Union would permit the unification of Germany. And most dramatically of all, the Maastricht Treaty, the Maastricht Summit, which was held on the 9th and 10th of December 1991, was of course held the day after the signature of the Belaveja Accords, which dissolved the Soviet Union on the 8th of December 1991. So I could conclude by saying that ideology was the handmaiden of geopolitics. The old alchemists' phrase, solve et coagula, destroy in order to rebuild, has become the new slogan of today's political alchemists. The West has taken this notion to heart. It's long since embarked on a post-national and even world revolutionary project of which Trotsky could only dream. And George Orwell's greatest prediction, he predicted many great things, but his greatest prediction is often overlooked, and that is that he predicted the convergence that would happen after the end of the Cold War. The last line of Animal Farm is, the animals looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again, and already it was impossible to say which was which. Thank you.
Джон, большое спасибо за интересную лекцию с большим количеством наглядных примеров и из нашего прошлого, и из нашего настоящего. Мы сейчас перейдем к сессии вопросов. Пожалуйста, те, кто готовы будут задать вопрос, вы пока подготовьтесь и четко сформулируйте и когда будете выступать, обязательно, ну или с комментарием обязательно представляйтесь. Но у нас есть еще 2 вопроса из интернета. Я зачитаю. Значит, появление национализма как идеологии связано с переходом Европы от феодального строя к буржуазному в первой половине XIX века, когда на смену Европе королей пришла Европа наций. Какие изменения в структуре общества стимулируют переход от национализма к интернационализму и глобализму? Сложный вопрос. Какие изменения в структуре общества стимулируют переход от национализма к интернационализму и глобализму?
Well, I don't, yeah. Shall I answer this question first?
Ну, да, наверное.
I don't agree at all with the first part of the question. Nationalism, well, the political ideology known as nationalism, yes, is usually identified with the 19th century because, of course, that was when Germany and Italy were united as nation states, and it's when the national idea took root in other countries in Eastern Europe, Central Europe. It's true that that was the time of the Hungarian rebellion and the growth of the national idea in Romania and so on. But the idea that nationhood or the concept of nation was born in the 19th century, I'm sorry, is completely ridiculous and very unhistorical. The idea of nation is much, much older than that. It's in fact an eternal idea. In Rome, there are many very beautiful buildings in Rome, but there's a very early building, I've forgotten exactly when it dates from, but it shows it was a hospice where pilgrims would sleep when they came to Rome after their pilgrimages. And on the walls of this thing, you can see there are depictions of the different Nazi from all over Europe who would come in the Middle Ages on their Roman pilgrimage. So I can't really agree with the idea that, which incidentally sounds to me a rather Marxist way of putting things, the idea that there's a social or economic reality and that there's a political superstructure. That's not my view of the world at all. But to answer the question, the second part of the question, what led to this move from nationalism to internationalism is all the things I've been talking about. The spread of left-wing ideology, the spread of Marxist, specifically Marxist ideology. And above all, the idea, which I mentioned briefly with respect to the French Revolution, but which I'll repeat and develop a little bit now. The idea, the key idea in these ideologies is a metaphysical idea. It's a view of reality. The idea is that there is in fact no reality. There is no fixed reality, and that reality is in a state of permanent movement. Engels, again, is very, very eloquent about this. Engels describes, in the Anti-Düring, he says, I haven't got the quotations here, but he says that everything is in a permanent state of change. Nothing is fixed. Everything is always developing. And this is a metaphysics, it's a metaphysical doctrine. It's associated with Heraclitus in ancient Greece. But it is a very widespread view, and many supporters of European integration, many people who are therefore internationalists, say a nation state, it's just one form of political arrangement among others. It'll come, it'll go. There is no fixed reality, just like the family will one day evolve into something else. That is exactly the metaphysics of the European idea. That's what these people like about the European idea. What they like is, and what they say in their writings, is that political structures, just as I said about the French Revolution, must not be inherited. You must not think that you've inherited anything in politics. Instead, politics is only about choice and decision. So if you've inherited your country with its history and geography and that's wrong. No, you can't have that. Instead, political structures must be based only on choice. And that is a metaphysics with which I fundamentally disagree. fundamentally disagree because it doesn't correspond, in my view, to reality. The reality is that we are born into a particular national context, that nations do exist, that there are social groups called nations, which are united by common language, common history, common geography, and so on. And that the attempt to change this reality by pretending it doesn't exist is to commit a great act of violence against society.
Yeah.
And incidentally, we are seeing this act of violence being committed today by the migration flow into Europe, of which the German president, Joachim Gauck, said it was a good thing because it will help Europe to distance itself from the idea that Europe must be white, Christian, and German-speaking. He was talking about Germany. So there is a clear ideological justification behind the current importation of over 1 million people into the European Union in less than 1 year.
Да, буквально вчера как раз на эту тему дискутировали с политологом немецким Александром Раром, который пытался объяснить, почему вот немецкое руководство сегодня придерживается такой политики. И абсолютно правильно то, что вы объяснили. Надеюсь, наш зритель получил ответ на его вопрос. Ну что, перейдем, наверное, к сидящей в зале аудитории. Но мы его оставим еще, может быть, сначала вопросы ребят. Дмитрий, у нас присутствует представитель журнала «Политика экстерна». Это такой студенческий журнал Высшей школы экономики. Ну, расскажите немножко еще о журнале. У Дмитрия есть вопросы к вам, Джон.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your lecture. As Natalia said, our student journal was established at the Higher School of Economics, and I'm also from Latvia, and people there are worried about the migrant crisis you just mentioned. Do you think this is a real threat to Europe?
I think it's an absolutely deadly existential threat. The arrival of so many people in such a short time, supported as it is by this anti-national ideology, it of course is going to create problems, not create problems, it's going to aggravate a situation which is already extremely bad in Europe. I know in the Baltic states you don't have, in Latvia you have emigration, you in a sense you don't have enough people. It's a different problem. But as everybody knows, in the big European cities, there are already huge areas in the suburbs particularly, areas populated by immigrants and the children or grandchildren of immigrants, where law and order has broken down, where the state is effectively absent, where the police don't go, and so on. The aggravation of this already unstable situation by the sudden arrival of millions of people, there are literally, since the summer of last year, between 5,000 and 10,000 people have arrived every day in Europe, every day. Up until the winter, it was 10,000 a day. 10,000 people a day is 3.5 million, 3.6 million a year. It's 3 million people a year. We have this problem already in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is not affected, of course, by this Balkan migration because we're separated by the sea. But we have in Britain internal migration, net internal migration of 600,000 a year. 600,000 people a year. The city where I live in England has a population of 80,000. That means there are 5 times the city of Bath. 8 5s are 40, more than 5 times, 6 or 7 times the population of Bath being imported into the United Kingdom every year. You know, no state can sustain this kind of movement, particularly not when it is very sudden and when, of course, there is no selection of the people who are coming in. So I absolutely think it is a threat, yes.
Джон, можно в продолжение вопроса Дмитрия я тоже спрошу? Но вы представитель западной нации, уж западнее некуда, что называется, оплот. Но если люди, эксперты, интеллигенты понимают ситуацию, они видят угрозу, да? Почему тогда политика...
They don't. Yeah, sorry.
Ну, нет, наверное же, не все...
Well, obviously,
Есть люди, которые разделяют вашу позицию, достаточно много они выходят на улицы. Почему тогда политика руководства этих государств никак не меняется?
what we have in all European states, and of course in the European Union itself, is a oligarchical system. We don't live in democracies in Western Europe. We live in oligarchies, where a political class controls the state and divides the state up between itself. There's no the left-right distinctions, the social democratic, Christian democratic parties. Germany is the best example of this. As you know, the German government now is a coalition between the supposedly opposing parties. So we can see that there is no real political difference. And in order to maintain itself in power, this oligarchy needs to maintain its ideological supremacy, and it does that by demonizing anybody who questions, for example, immigration. Immigration and discussions about immigration are a political taboo in Europe. If you start to say you don't want immigration, you are immediately classified as extreme right and excluded from the margins of political correctness. So I would say to you that very few people, some, of course, people and ordinary people understand it, and some intellectuals understand it, but the political class, which, as I say, is impregnated with this post-national ideology and which wants to finish nations, because nations means democracy and accountability. They prefer to take decisions around a table like this behind closed doors. That's how the European Union works. All the laws in the European Union are voted in secret. You must understand that. I mean, I'm not joking. I'm not making this up. There is the laws are voted in secret. We do not know who voted for European Union laws. I was very shocked, by the way, yesterday in MGIMO. I saw 3 timetables up for lectures. Politica ES, Economica ES, Prava ES. Only teaching ES in Moscow University. It's incredible. This is an oligarchy. It's an oligarchy that nobody knows who voted for European laws. This is absolutely elementary principle of democracy. And as I say, these people have economic and ideological reasons for supporting migration. I quoted President Gauck. There are other quotations by leaders, by other German and other European leaders who also, there's in particular the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees, who is an Irishman called Peter Sutherland, has also said that these kind of developments, so migration and European integration, should break the homogeneity of European nations. So we literally are dealing with social engineers, people who want to change or break, I would say, the nature of European societies. And sorry, just very quickly, like everything, there is also an economic interest behind this. But to put it very simply, if you import a large number of people from the Middle East, you will drive down wages, because you will suddenly find a lot of people without qualifications, and that keeps down wages. And for many years and decades now, Western countries have been running on a completely schizophrenic policy, where on the one hand they maintain a social state which more or less protects people, and on the other hand they import massive amounts of cheap labor in order to keep the cost of labor down.
Среди наших слушателей есть ваш коллега по Европейскому Союзу, гражданин Европейского Союза, точнее Германии. Комментарий, вопрос, пожалуйста, Юлия Шат.
Yes, both. Thank you very much. My greatest gratitude, Mr. Lachlan. I'm from Germany. I grew up in Germany. I was socialized in Germany, and I always felt that something was not right in Germany. I just could not define what it was. As I now understand, our media is it is a public relations organ of the European Union and of our political class. This is the reason why there is no vivid debate or objective debate going on in Europe right now. Also, the national governments in the West, they are administrations. They only manage the people that live on our territories. The former national states that officially still seem to exist, they do not exist anymore. What we face right now is a dictatorship of neoliberal transnational corporations that have taken advantage or maybe have been infiltrated even by these neo-Marxistic ideologists from the 60s who have influenced society in a fundamental way. By doing so, the combination between neoliberal transnational corporations and a society that does not define itself by national identity makes it very easy for these corporations to neutralize not just the national identity and national state, but also expand its economic influence in spheres. If we pay our attention to the political map, the physical map, it does not exist for these corporations. These corporations, they possess a sphere of influence, of economic influence, and which is a very interesting thing when comparing the socialistic ideology from the Marxists and the Leninists and also from Trotsky. They oppose capitalism, and now capitalism has become a hybrid between a neoliberal money-making machine that is using the people who think that they live in freedom because they have neutralized the national state. My question is, so if you agree that corporatism or neoliberal capitalism, which does not represent traditional capitalism, has pushed forward a further neutralization of the national states by using the ideology of universalism, and the cultural Marxism and the neo-Marxism has led to a nihilistic and a decadence in society, and therefore these corporations, they can control masses of people now. So the people that are behind this new world order, do you think these people are the transnational corporations, or who are they?
I mean, not only, but that's very much part of the picture, and you're absolutely right to mention it. There's a sort of revolving door, actually, very often between the corporations and some of these structures. Many individuals have passed between one and the other. I mentioned Peter Sutherland just now. Peter Sutherland has a job at the United Nations now, but he is from, if I'm not mistaken, Goldman Sachs, and has had various other functions in the past. Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank, is also a previous employee of Goldman Sachs. Lots of people have worked for Goldman Sachs, and then one of the Greek prime ministers as well. So yes, there is, of course, an economic motive behind this, and it's expressed in the way that these people can pass, as I say, between the private sector and the public sector in such a way. The fact that they can do so shows something that actually Yvonne Blot, as a point Yvonne Blot makes and made again yesterday. One of the structural problems in politics today is that there are nowhere in any single European country do you ever find statesmen or politicians who come from the armed forces. You've got this, of course, in Russia currently, where, as everybody keeps repeating, Vladimir Putin used to work for the KGB. Well, working for the KGB meant that he had a military rank. He was a colonel or something. He had a military rank, and his upbringing was in an ideology of service of the state, whatever one might think of the KGB. Just as an army officer would have that ideology bred into him, like de Gaulle, for example. Instead, if you're a banker or if you're, a professional politician, you don't have that same. You're not given that same culture of service of the state, which you do have if you're an officer. You said one thing which I very strongly agree with, and I'd like to develop a little bit. You said at one point, people who think that they live in freedom. One of the most striking aspects for me of the current situation, and this also is a reply, actually, a further reply to your question, Natalia. You asked me, why don't people do anything? The fact is that the dominant ideology, which is indeed an ideology of freedom, of emancipation from your national context, emancipation from the family, emancipation even from your own biology, because of all the LGBT doctrines. This ideology has penetrated the minds of people across Europe far more deeply than Soviet ideology ever penetrated into the minds of Soviet citizens. I mean, I'm sure some of you know this to be true, that the Soviet ideology was simply not taken seriously for the last 20 or 30 years, at least, of the Soviet Union's existence. And this is one of the absolutely fundamental differences. Whereas you had a skepticism or cynicism in this country towards the ruling ideology, it's almost entirely absent. It's not completely absent, of course, but it is very absent, if I may use that expression, among the elites. There are, of course, ordinary people who don't believe the ideology and who react against it, but the elites are overwhelmingly penetrated by it and actually believe it. They actually believe, they actually accepted it. So they, for example, are convinced of their own superiority, of their own progressiveness, that their societies are much more advanced than other societies, and so on and so forth. And again, that's one of the very paradoxical phenomena, really, that we observe if we look at the history of the end of the Cold War.
So may I?
Юлия,
Just
у
one
нас...
second. This is actually the reason why there cannot be a partnership between Russia and the European Union. Just because of that, because Russia is a national state, it still has a military, it is
exactly.
independent more or less, and it does not accept this ideology of like LGBT.
Yeah, it's a very important point. It's one of the points. There are other reasons as well, but perhaps I should move on to another. I'm happy to talk about this as well, but perhaps if there are other people who want to ask questions.
Спасибо большое за комментарии, Юлия. У нас есть вопрос от студентки Высшей школы экономики. Не стесняйтесь, задавайте вопрос, пожалуйста, только ближе к микрофону. И представьтесь, пожалуйста.
Well, my name is Tatiana Viryanova, and well, I have a question which is how do you think, well, given the rapidly changing situation that we now observe, the relations between the EU member states and like the European Union itself and Russia will evolve in the future? Yeah, that's it.
Right now, there is no, there seems to be no prospect at all of any improvement. On the contrary, everything indicates that the relations will continue to be very bad. For as long as the system remains in place in the European Union, they will remain bad. Firstly, because of misunderstandings, the kinds of things I've been talking about, but above all, because hostility to Russia serves a political purpose. It serves, in fact, two political purposes. It serves the purpose of reinforcing or appearing to reinforce internal European unity. Everybody knows that the European Union is in deep crisis and that there are a series of crises within the European Union. There is the famous crisis between the North and the South over the euro, which lasted from 2009 until 2015, particularly between Germany and Greece. That lasted for 5 years. Now there's an East-West crisis because, again, Germany has one view on migration, and the countries of Central Europe, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary have a radically different crisis. There's also an ongoing problem with the United Kingdom. So in order to reinforce, or to appear to reinforce, what is in fact a very divided European Union, internally divided. So Russia is presented as a threat and as an enemy, and that of course serves or is supposed to serve the purpose of reinforcement. Secondly, it's a different way of saying the same thing. Russia embodies for these European ideologues everything which the European Union is not and should not be. So it's not just an outside enemy in an ordinary geopolitical sense, it's also an ideological enemy, because Europe is post-national, post-historic, post-Christian. Europe supports, as you said, the point is not LGBT rights, it's the ideology of transgender, transhumanism, if you like. It's the ideology really of the denial of reality. And above all, the European Union, in an incredibly sinister and hypocritical way, believes that it is finished with the policy of power, and that it is advanced to a higher stage of human development, in which power, force, military force, is no longer used. This is one of the absolutely founding ideologies of the European Union. And it's a point that's very, very emotional. It's extremely emotional for, again, I come back particularly for German politicians, not only for Germans, but particularly in Germany. And Germany, of course, exerts a dominant influence in the European Union. The Germans have managed to convince themselves, not the Germans, but the German elite, that they have advanced to a higher stage of politics in which force is not and should not be an instrument of politics. Force, but military force or any force. So, this is incidentally the reason why Angela Merkel was so hawkish, was so hostile to Russia over the Ukrainian crisis. Because from their perspective, which is a wrong perspective in my view, but what they see is Russia wielding force to grab territory and to invade other countries. That's how the Germans see it. That's why Angela Merkel, when she came to Moscow on the 10th of May last year, when she read out her press communique next to Vladimir Putin, she inserted a word which was not in the original text. She was talking about the annexation of Crimea. And the text said, die völkerrechtswidrige Eingliederung der Krim, which means the annexation of Crimea, which is against international law. But as she was reading the text, she saw a big word beginning with V, and she misread it. And she said, die verbrecherische und völkerrechtswidrige Eingliederung, the criminal and illegal annexation. Because the Germans, as I say, the German elite has got its head into this, it got into its head this idea that power and force should no longer be used. So, and this is where the whole thing becomes completely schizophrenic. So when the European Union signs an association agreement with a country, that is freedom. That is a country making its free choice. But when Russia signs an association agreement with a country, that is Russia building a sphere of influence and trying to recreate the Soviet Union. It's literally paranoid schizophrenia. You know, these people are not capable of seeing how they themselves might be perceived. That's why it's so dangerous. Another example of the phenomena I'm talking about is a statement made by Frauke Petry, the speaker of the Alternative für Deutschland party. She was asked what would happen, what did she propose to do about the migration crisis, and she said, well, I can't remember exactly what she said, but more or less she said, well, the law has to be observed, and at one point she said, and if necessary, force must be used. So she was talking about a situation in which you have migrants and the police, and the migrants try and do something they're not allowed to do, like enter the country or whatever. And she said, well, ultimately, firearms might need to be used. And this statement, that firearms might need to be used, was regarded as the most terrifying and disgraceful thing that anybody had said since Adolf Hitler. But again, the schizophrenia, every single policeman in Germany carries a gun. Every single policeman in the whole of Europe, except in Britain, carries a gun. How can anybody regard it as shocking for a politician to say that in extremis, the policeman might need to use violence? That's part of what a policeman is. In French, it's called a gendarme because he has an arm. He carries a gun. So, for these ideological and geopolitical reasons, as long as the elite will do everything it can to hold on to its power, and the hostility to Russia is one of the instruments, and it's an increasingly important instrument for holding on to power.
Okay, thank you very much for the answer. And in continuation, can I also ask you how the situation might affect the Russian and the European Union's common partners?
I'm sorry, they're which partners?
Common partners, I mean countries that are not part of the European Union, but countries that the European Union has some economic partnerships or like any cooperation, and also Russia has some kind of cooperation, how these countries might be affected.
Which countries are you thinking of?
Well, yeah, the Eastern Partnership, for example. I'm talking about this year.
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that to some extent, the sanctions policy is again hypocritical and schizophrenic because, as we all know, in spite of them, cooperation in some areas continues. They've just launched a rocket to go to Mars. It's a European-Russian joint project. It's a pretty important project. That hasn't been affected by the sanctions. The Eastern Partnership is just a racket. It's a joke. I mean, the Ukraine now buys gas at 30% more expensive than it was before the 1st of January 2016, because the agreement entered into force at the beginning of this year. We all know that the economy there is in free fall. Same thing in Moldova. It's also, incidentally, the Eastern Partnership is also a complete failure, just in a factual sense, because the Eastern Partnership was supposed to have 6 states: Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, and the 3 Caucasus republics. Well, the only ones that have signed are all what we call rump states. So the thing that Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine all have in common is that they have lost part of their territory for various reasons over time. And of course, they're exceptionally poor. So, but the more promising states, the ones that, particularly Belarus, but also Armenia and Azerbaijan, who were intended to be included in it, they of course didn't. They never even contemplated signing it.
Давайте уже немножко завершать. У нас еще есть один вопрос, и напоследок вопрос из интернета будет.
Thank you very much. I understand that I have very limited time, so I have 2 questions actually.
Just represent yourself.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. My name is Katya Kopilova. I'm a PhD researcher at Gilmore University in International Criminal Law. So I'll ask you only one question, or it's not really a question, it's a request to comment on something that you said about the ICC, the
Yes.
International Criminal Court. I have worked at the ICC for 2 years at the Office of the Prosecutor and also on the Libyan and Darfur cases. So maybe I have misunderstood you, but what you said about immunity, that is allotted to the judges, and on the other hand is denied to the president.
No, to the defense.
To the defense, and you also said that it's denied to the president of the country.
You're absolutely sorry. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. It certainly is. Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that I can completely agree with this comparison, because immunity for presidents and for the heads of states, for the ministers, whatever, is denied to the extent that they commit violations, serious violations of the international criminal law, of the international humanitarian law. And on the other hand, their immunity is respected to what concerns all the other aspects of their activities. And the immunity of judges belongs to them because to allow them to perform their functions. But if the judges were to commit international crimes, immunity would be denied as well.
No, it wouldn't. There's no provision at all for such immunity to be lifted. On the contrary, the statute says that they are immune from legal prosecution of any kind for any acts committed or any acts undertaken in their capacity as judges. Now, you're right to say that judges of the International Criminal Court cannot wage war. However, torture is considered an international crime. And if you illegally or abusively imprison a person, if you then kill them, or they die as a result of their imprisonment, or if they are taken, as has happened, out of prison only on condition that they testify in prosecution as prosecution witnesses against other indictees, as happened in the Milosevic trial, and as has probably happened in many, many, many other trials, then they are committing international crimes, or at least I think they're committing international crimes. And yet, as I say, there is no possible way of, there is no legal way by which they can be prosecuted for those crimes. The key point, however, is not, in posing your question, I think you've betrayed a certain misunderstanding of the constitutional problem. Even if, and the misunderstanding is this, the issue of immunity is simply an expression, or the existence of immunity is the expression of the existence of a legal order. So all legal orders culminate in a point of immunity. Okay, all of them. When we talk about state immunity, it's simply, state immunity is not some exorbitant privilege given to unscrupulous state leaders, which allows them to murder their own citizens, which is the caricature that the International Criminal Court presents. State immunity, or sovereign immunity, is literally the expression of a legal system. What I mean by that is that all legal systems have such immunity at their apex. Why do they have it at their apex? The reason why they have it at their apex is that it could not be any other way. If you have a judicial system, you have a lower court and a higher court and so on. So you're prosecuted by a lower court, you appeal, you go to the higher court, you appeal, you go to the Supreme Court, you go to the Court of Human Rights. At some point, in all legal systems, the appeal procedure stops and you have no further possibilities of appeal. You can't say, I want my case to be adjudicated by the General Assembly of the United Nations or whatever. It simply stops. The buck stops, and that is that. And that is what a legal system is. A legal system is a system in which power is wielded sovereignly, and it is not, it cannot be adjudicated legally. So, and that incidentally is the reason why, you know, typically we don't say that a prison commander, a prison governor is a kidnapper. You know, we don't say a policeman is a bank robber or whatever, because the force that they use is enshrined in the legal system, which, as I say, is unimpeachable. It's unimpeachable. At its apex, it cannot be impeached. It can only be impeached by non-legal means, so by revolution, by violence. It's the only way you can radically change a system. And the same is true of the International Criminal Court. It is no different in that respect from any other legal structure, except that it is actually worse than a national legal structure, than a state. Because in a national state, you always have some mechanism, leaving aside the possibility of a violent revolution. There is always, at least on paper, some mechanism by which the head of state can be, you know, removed from office or questioned or whatever. What is particularly diabolical with these international structures is that there is absolutely no way that the countries over which these structures wield power can ever exercise any influence over the decisions that are taken by those organizations. So it's a gross and systematic violation of the most elementary principles of constitutional law. And I repeat, you know, there are very serious allegations against these courts. Everybody assumes that they are virtuous. They're not virtuous. They acted in the Libyan case with outrageous illegality. And in the Sudanese case, in the Libyan case, the prosecution was a complete joke. The prosecutor lied when he said he had evidence of crimes committed by Gaddafi. He lied. The evidence of these crimes was reports from CNN and reports from the CIA and from non-governmental organizations whose officers later turned out to be, later were ministers and ambassadors for the new Libyan government. It was a grotesque charade. And I hope that the realization will soon dawn that the power wielded by these judges and these prosecutors is exactly like all other political power. It has to be encased in a constitutional framework. And what is particularly dangerous about the International Criminal Court is that it isn't. It's systemically detached from the people over whom it wields power. It is literally power without responsibility.
Спасибо большое, Джон. У нас сегодня очень подготовленная аудитория, все задают вопросы на английском языке, но я как модератор продолжу говорить на русском языке и задам вопрос тоже на русском. Исходя из современного понимания близости марксизма и либерализма, меняется ли отношение к практике существования Советского Союза как государства?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Да, я тоже не с первого раза. Да, the second question. Видимо, имеется в виду, меняется ли отношение на Западе к Советскому Союзу.
So,
Поскольку марксизм и либерализм
исходя из
одно и то же
современного-
в интерпретации читателя. Вообще вопросы, конечно, через
So
интернет.
is the
мудрёные.
question the question is the understanding of the практика существования Советского
Меняете
Союза
ли отношение к Советскому Союзу
к
на
Советскому
Западе,
Союзу вообще?
исходя из того, что либераль...
No, not really, because as I say, the Soviet Union, from the point of view of this ideology, was dismissed as a reactionary force, and that has not changed. It was dismissed as a reactionary force when it existed, because that was the Trotskyite view of the Soviet Union. The Trotskyite view of the Soviet Union was that Stalin was a deviationist who had abandoned the world revolution and had decided to create socialism in one country, and that by doing so he had become a reactionary. And that is exactly the view that prevails today, not only of the Soviet Union, but also, of course, of Russia. Because let's never forget, the Trotskyite view was that Soviet communism was nothing but Russian imperialism in a new form. Similarly, across Eastern and Central Europe today, the feeling is very widely held that Russia today, the imperialism of the Russian Federation today, is nothing but the continuation of the Soviet imperialism of the past. So, no, I think that the movements I've described do not change, certainly not in any positive way, the perceptions of the Soviet Union. If anything, the perceptions of the Soviet Union are worse now than they were at the time of the Soviet Union. I've already said there were plenty of pro-Soviet communist parties in Western Europe and in America, not so much in America, but there were in Western Europe. There were a whole stream of intellectuals who traveled to the Soviet Union in the 30s, at the worst time of the Soviet dictatorship, who famously, of course, reported that the granaries were full and that the Soviet Union was the future and so on. Indeed, today, students at the LSE, which is the equivalent of the Wyższa Szkoła Ekonomiki, very often have their, I'm not sure if it's a residential building or a lecture hall building, but there is a building called Passmore, I think, Passmore or Passwell building, Passmore building. I've forgotten the name, but anyway, Passmore is the aristocratic title that was given to Sidney Webb. Sidney and Beatrice Webb were two extreme pro-Stalinist communists in England in the 1930s, who wrote books. They famously wrote a book called "The Truth About the Soviet Union." This truth about the Soviet Union was to counter people who criticized the Soviet Union at the time. And their memory, as I say, is preserved even today because they are considered as icons of progressive thinking.
Джон, большое спасибо вам за лекцию. Чудесный язык, которым можно просто наслаждаться, даже не вникая в суть, но при этом суть была шикарной. Поблагодарим нашего лектора за выступление. И еще я напомню, ребята, вам и нашим зрителям, что в понедельник у нас состоится лекция Михаила Делягина, поэтому вы можете регистрироваться на сайте Фонда исторической перспективы, сайт креативной дипломатии и приходить на лекцию. Спасибо большое.
Спасибо.
До свидания.
Ты отметила успех?